thank you for joining NCPERS Center for Online Learning. I apologize for the technical delay in broadcasting this webcast, but we are planning to do a full program. My name is Hank Kim, and I'm the Executive Director and Counsel for the National Conference on Public Employee Retirement Systems. Today, we are hosting a webcast on state and federal legislation 2015 mid-year review. As most state legislatures have adjourned for the year, and as Congress is about to go into its August recess, we felt it was a good time to check in and see what's transpired since our January webcast and to look ahead to this fall. Joining me today are two familiar figures from our last webcast: Bailey Childers, Executive Director of the National Public Pension Coalition, NPPC, and Tony Roda, partner at the law and lobbying firm of Williams & Jensen. New to the panel is Leigh Snell, Director of Federal Relations at the National Council on Teacher Retirement, NCTR. Welcome. The format we will follow today is moderated conversation with our three panelists covering select states and federal legislation. We will then pivot to outlook for the remainder of 2015. We encourage audience members to participate by submitting questions to our panelists through the GoToMeetings questions portal. However, to ensure that we can cover as many topics as possible, we will hold all questions till the last part of the program. We have a lot to cover, so let's get right to it. Bailey, we had this first webcast back in January. We had a number of states that we were concerned about. Tell us what's transpired in the first 6 months.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that, and thank you for hosting, Hank. I appreciate it. So I actually have good news to report from, which maybe I wasn't necessarily expecting from our January webcast. So on the whole, what we've seen in states this year is that states are starting to reject these misguided attempts to move public employees from a defined benefit pension system to another less secure form of retirement, either a 401k style plan or a hybrid or cash balance. Really across the country, we saw debates. Nevada, for example, debated a hybrid bill this year. A couple of states had different opt-out provisions to allow employees to opt out of the DB, which again undermines the stability of the system. And we beat a lot of that legislation. So Nevada, they did not end up passing a hybrid bill, which we were very happy to see.
Although I would say, I think in terms of terminology, we would prefer combination, right?
Sure,
yes.
Great,
combination
great point,
right.
Great point.
Yeah.
But Colorado, again, was a state where they wanted to let employees opt out. We were able to defeat that in Colorado. North Dakota had proposed, they had a bill to move employees to a 401k style plan. That did not move in North Dakota. And we saw that in many different states. In some states, like Florida, for example, where we thought, I'm pretty sure I talked about that at this time in our last webinar, our last webcast. Florida didn't even end up doing anything to try to convert their public employees. So I'm really happy with those results. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I think first of all, we've done a good job, the folks at this table, the folks that are on the webcast and other partners in states really doing good education to policymakers about why defined benefit pension plans are so much better, not just for taxpayers in the state as far as cost efficiencies, but also for public workers and actually having decent retirement security and it being a good workforce management tool and all the other positive things we know about pensions. We're also starting to see pension systems recover from the recession, which I know we've all talked about and expected as, personal accounts have started to recover from the recession as well. And so I think policymakers, especially those that, for more ideological reasons, we're trying to eliminate pensions. They don't really have the ability to say anymore, oh, we're in a crisis. The Center for Retirement Research at Boston College did a great report that I would encourage folks to look at. And they project by 2018, I think the average pension system will be back to 80% funding, which is considered healthy. So I think there's a couple of factors that helped us do well in states this year, but on the whole have been really happy with the results and glad that folks are going to continue to have their retirement security after this year. So, during the question time, if people have, specific questions about states, I'm happy to mention that. One other state I should throw in, there were a couple of states that actually did positive things this year. So not just that we were able to defend against bad bills, but we actually were able to do positive things in a couple of states. One of those was Texas, where they were able to secure some additional funding in the budget to pay the unfunded liability, which is great. Anytime we're getting commitments from a state to pay its annually required contribution like it's supposed to, that's a good thing for the system. And Indiana as well passed some proactive legislation to help stabilize its system after getting rid of some bad legislation. So actually had a couple of positive victories in states this year. So really happy to see that.
Well, I'm glad we started off with you.
Yeah.
Now, so to continuing with that trend, I think, Tony, you have some good news coming from Washington, D.C. as well. I mean, I think the popular notion is that Congress isn't doing anything, but at least on the public pension front, they have done a couple of things.
Absolutely, Hank, and thanks again for inviting me to be here and to talk about these issues that are really very important. Congress got off to a tremendous start, a very positive start in the 114th Congress, and has actually enacted 2 new public laws dealing with benefits for public safety employees. The first is Public Law 114-14, and it's called Don't Tax Our Fallen Public Safety Heroes Act, and that's the survivor benefits provision. The Internal Revenue Service began questioning whether a survivor benefit that was provided through state law was in fact exempt from federal tax. And this happened in New Hampshire, caught the attention of Senator Kelly Ayotte of New Hampshire. This was last Congress. Remarkably, within a year, Congress and the President have changed the Internal Revenue Code to clarify that both federal and state-based survivor benefits for public safety, on behalf of a public safety employee who has died in the line of duty, are exempt from federal tax. That's a tremendous achievement in a very short period of time. And the second new public law, Defending Public Safety's Employees Retirement Act, deals with an expansion of a provision that already was in the Internal Revenue Code, and that's Section 72T10. 72T10 was enacted back in 2006 in the Pension Protection Act, and what that did was for state and local public safety employees, it provided when they were separated from service at age 50, they could receive their distribution without the 10% tax penalty. What this new public law does is it expands that exemption to include federal law enforcement officials, to include distributions from defined contribution plans. The initial law was only for distributions from defined benefit plans. And it also would allow a person to modify a stream of payments that they have received, that they have begun to receive, and that would not trigger the penalty. So this expansion is something that we've worked on, and NCPERS has been on the field working on this for several years, and we're pleased to see that this has become law as well. This was signed into law in June. It's Public Law 114-26, and it would affect those distributions that begin with January 1, 2016. So following up with Bailey, this has been a very good start to the Congress, and we're pleased and hope that this will continue.
Great, and I know we have a number of other federal things we want to talk about, but we'll save that for the second half. So Leigh, welcome. Thanks for joining us. And I think in some respects, the topic you're going to talk about, it's, glass could be viewed as glass half full, right? So the topic is Senator or Chairman Orrin Hatch's safe, secure annuities for employees legislation. Do you want to give us a little history on what that legislation was, and then we can talk a little bit about what we think is going to happen with that?
Sure. Be happy to, Hank. And thank you also for asking me to join you and Bailey and Tony, a distinguished group. Real pleasure. I thought you were leaving me to deliver the bad news.
No.
But actually, it's, I guess, to the extent we've not seen this legislation introduced yet in this Congress, I guess we could maybe take that as good news, but I don't think it's going to last. So as Hank said, I'm going to give you a brief rundown on S 1270, which was introduced in the last Congress by Senator Orrin Hatch, who, as Hank noted, is the chairman of the powerful Senate Finance Committee. And this is part of a larger bill. It's Title I, and it's called the SAFE Act, the Save Annuities for Employees, Safe Annuities for Employees Act. So we're concerned only with Title I. There are other sections that I'm not going to talk about. Title I is essentially a replacement for the defined benefit plan, in that if you had a defined benefit plan and you wanted to go this annuities route, you would not be able to offer both to employees. And essentially you would have to freeze the existing defined benefit plan in order to take this opportunity. Now, this is not a mandated provision. Senator Hatch is not requiring states to do this. He's presenting it as an option. And it's essentially, if you think about it, a series of stacked annuities. The employer would, on an annual basis, go out with an RFP to the private sector insurance industry for individual annuities for all of its employees. And then on an annual basis, you would get another annuity and another annuity and another annuity. Interesting concept. The employer, however, would not be required, once it had taken this route and basically frozen its defined benefit plan, would not be required every year to purchase an annuity. And even though the legislation had a cap with regard to how much compensation the employer could contribute, and it would only be employer dollars going into it, it would not be employee contributions to this annuity purchase. That level is also uncertain from year to year. So essentially, in theory, maybe you'd have a series of stacked annuities over 30 years, and Senator Hatch's argument is you get to where we are today, but we don't have the risk associated. He wants to put the risk all on the insurance industry. But I think really, and we can get into this a little bit more later, I think the risk still stays on the employee. You won't know for sure what kind of a retirement benefit, what amount you will get, whether you will get it. Senator Hatch also would not allow those annuities to begin to be paid out until age 67. So there are a lot of provisions in the Hatch bill dealing with the annuity approach that are very prescriptive. It's not just that, oh, we're going to help you go out and buy these annuities if you want to do this. If you do that, you're going to have to do it this way, this way, this way. So that, in pretty much of a nutshell, is what the Hatch bill would provide.
Okay, thank you for that summary and review. So what do we expect later on this year? Do we expect the SAFE bill to be reintroduced? What have the conversations been like with the staff? And I guess maybe from the audience perspective, what's the impetus? Why is this legislation necessary?
Sure. Well, I think, you know, that's significant. Senator Hatch approaches this from the perspective that a defined benefit plan is inappropriate for use in the public sector. So we're really not talking about trying to fix a defined benefit plan or reform it. We're really, again, talking about replacing it. There's a lot of speculation about why Senator Hatch decided to go after public sector plans. He was in a significant challenge faced him in his last election, which he was obviously reelected, but I think there was some concern on his part running against a state senator who had championed pension reform in Utah that he needed to get tough on public pensions. And so he has really, unfortunately, again, decided that it's not something he wants to fix. He really wants to replace them. We will see the legislation reintroduced this year. I'm quite confident of that. As you know, you and I have met with Senator Hatch's staffer, Preston Rutledge, who has essentially told us that it will be modified. We're not sure where the modifications will exist. There's some discussion about making it a little less restrictive in terms of how the state would go out with its RFP. Right now, the bill that's been introduced previously would say every year. I think there's some concern that that might be a little too demanding. It's a lot for a plan to put out an RFP. That's not a simple, easy process. And I think the insurance industry also would probably like to see some change there. But again, I think Senator Hatch is, and I think this is important as we approach how to deal with this bill, Senator Hatch is not interested in, as I said, using a defined benefit model as the basis. He's really interested in replacing it with these stacked annuities, and that's significant.
Okay. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But Tony, going to you, what do we have for the balance of the year? You know, obviously next year is going to be a compressed year with the presidential election, but we have you know, a few more weeks or a few more days left in July. They'll go to their recess, and then beginning in September, what can we expect?
Well, you know, a lot of people talk about tax reform, and there's been tremendous effort and time put into that. The Senate Finance Committee broke up into 5 working groups, one of which dealt with savings and investments, which is where the pension issue lies. And they made the reports on July 8th to the chairman. Interestingly, that particular group in their cover page said, well, we only dealt with issues on which there was consensus, and these were bipartisan groups. And there was no mention of public pension issues, state and local governmental pension issues in the working group report. So I think that's a clear indication that there wasn't consensus on any federal initiative, for instance, the Hatch proposal, and that's why they were not in part of that. Tax reform, I don't think, really can come together until after the next presidential election. So we're going to see a period where ideas are floated, but not a lot of substantive legislative initiatives put forward. There are a couple of issues that could start to see a little more attention. Similar to the ones I talked about earlier, they're very narrow. But Congress seems to have an appetite for moving maybe more narrow pieces. One is the rather arcane rule but widely used pickup for employers. And there has been controversy back and forth about whether that particular rule as it's interpreted by the IRS should have more flexibility. There was a letter to the service from 2 senators and 2 members of Congress from Tennessee asking for a re-review of this particular issue. What that did was generate a lot of discussion among the Tennessee delegation and both the House and Senate tax writing committees. So there seems to be a little more interest and attention to the pickup issue. So we'll see how that goes. That issue is not without controversy, however, even within our own community. The other issue I'll talk about quickly is the windfall elimination provision, which is a Social Security Act provision, which reduces your Social Security benefit if you qualify for a state or local governmental pension. And this has been attacked since it was enacted back in the 80s. And the attacks have really come to repeal it. Well, Congressman Kevin Brady of Houston, Texas, has a new proposal, H.R. 711, excuse me, which would not repeal it, but it would reform it. And for those who are in WEP or do not reach age 62 by January 1 of 2017, there would be relief provided. You would stay within the WEP formula, but the estimates are that you would get a benefit increase of some 32% instead of the WEP'd amount, which is really not a word. For those who reach age 62 after that date, there would be a complete reformulation so that you would get the benefit that you should have received based on your actual work history. So it would no longer be arbitrary as it is under the law today. So there's definitely some interest there. Congressman Brady, of course, is a very senior member of the Ways and Means Committee. So I would look at those 2 issues as possibilities.
Okay. And Bailey, for you, what do you have on your plate for the balance of the year? As we mentioned, most states have recess for the year. Does that mean NPPC kicks back until January, or what do you got going on?
No, absolutely not. There's still a couple of states, a couple of big ones actually, that we're going to keep an eye on for the rest of the year. So Pennsylvania is one that is right in the heat of a big battle right now. So the Republican legislature in Pennsylvania has passed what was Senate Bill 1, which would convert new employees to a 401k system. And it's a very similar bill that Governor Corbett had tried to pass a couple years ago that completely failed because of the transition cost. But they went back for it again anyway, and Governor Wolf has vetoed that bill as of, I think it was a week and a half, maybe 2 weeks ago. And he also vetoed the full Republican budget. So there are a lot of negotiations left in Pennsylvania. And that's a state that will continue to monitor and be very active in.
And if I recall correctly, the issue in Pennsylvania was they were trying to tie budgeting with pension reform.
That's correct. And so far, the Republicans have still said, we're not going to give you what you want out of revenues in the budget until you do pension reform. And it's frustrating, right? Because they did pension reform in 2011 in Pennsylvania, but they're saying, oh, that's not good enough. We need to do more. Part of our argument is give it time to work, and you've already agreed to the ramps that you need to make to get the system back to where it needs to be. But so far, that's still what they're holding out for. And Michigan is another state we're keeping an eye on. So Michigan is interesting. NCPERS actually released a case study this year, Michigan was one of the states that they looked at. So states that have actually converted from a defined benefit to a 401k style plan for employees. So Michigan did that for its state employees in 1997. The results of that, as the report shows, the funding ratio of the plan went from 110% to 60%, and then the average that a worker is getting out of the 401k style system is around $8,600 a year, compared to what they got under the pension plan, which was around $20,000 a year. So much better retirement security under the pension system. Even though those numbers exist, they're there. You know, this has been in place since '97. We can look at that comparison. Michigan is talking about converting its public school retirement system to a 401k as well. And so that debate, they're on break for the summer. I think they had a couple of small, not small, I mean, I think it was like roads and transportation stuff they were trying to work on over the summer, but not in regular session. So we're looking at September to keep an eye on if that bill is going to move in Michigan.
Okay.
But it's kind of been sitting there for the year. But you know, and again, like we've got good data in Michigan to try to convince them that that's not a great idea. And so hopefully we're going to be able to be successful there. Illinois and New Jersey are two states that probably most folks on the webcast have, you know, read about in the news. So we know we continue to struggle with governors like Chris Christie, who just refused to make agreed-to pension payments, and that is a very tough situation. But it's one, you know, that the folks in state are continuing to say, you know, we came to the table in 2011, we agreed to reforms, employees are doing their part. We need the governor to stand up for, you know, for what he agreed to and what he promised. So Illinois and New Jersey will continue to keep an eye on those as well to see if we can continue to put pressure to get the payments made in those two states. Wisconsin is one that's still in session that we're also keeping an eye on, though, you know, the Wisconsin system is really well funded. And so if they start to try to tinker with that, it would be very unnecessary, because I think they're 99% funded. There's really no reason to make any changes in Wisconsin. And then for 2016, one state I just want to mention is California. So John Arnold and his friends in California, Reed and DeMaio, they tried to do a ballot measure, I think it was last year, and couldn't get it through. So they're talking about doing it again and putting it on the 2016 ballot. To really fundamentally change the way that retirement is given to public employees in California. So that will be very concerning if it's something that successfully goes on the ballot. They'll still have a lot of signatures to collect, but because the signatures are based on turnout in an election year, this last election year's turnout was much smaller than what they were dealing with the previous time they tried. So their threshold for getting it on the ballot is a lot smaller. And so that's something we're going to definitely keep an eye on for 2016. The other thing I just wanted to mention for folks that are on the webcast, so NPPC just this week sent out our guidelines and application process for grants for states for 2016. And so, you know, we try to keep as best of an eye out as we can on all of the states and what's going on related to pensions. But, you know, if you happen to be in a state where you're expecting unfavorable legislation in 2016, or you think there's an opportunity for us to do some proactive work in 2016, you know, I hope you'll be in contact through Hank, or, you know, Hank can get you my information. There are also, in many of the states that are on this webcast, coalitions already active. So if you're not a part of that, we definitely encourage you to join the coalition, or if it's the case where you need to put one together to do some either offensive or defensive work. We're starting to have those conversations now, and so we're definitely happy and would love to have you all be a part of that.
Great, great. So before we turn it back over to Leigh and Tony, I do want to mention a couple things regarding 2016, and it relates to some of the initiatives that we've been working on related to state initiatives for retirement security for the folks in the private sector. So, you know, building on the theme of good news, 2015, we had 4 additional states actually pass legislation to move the ball down the field in terms of retirement security. Those states were Virginia and Utah, who passed study commissions for this year. And additionally, Washington State and Orrin, who have passed legislation to begin implementing and start enrolling participants in their state-sponsored public-private partnership to address retirement insecurity in the private sector. And then most recently, a week ago, or just over a week ago, the president announced that he has directed the Department of Labor to have draft regulations for states as they begin to look into this area. So part of the reason why we haven't had as many states enact legislation is because of this uncertainty of whether states actually had a role and whether the federal regulations permitted a role. We think that this proposed regulation is going to clarify the uncertainty. It's going to allow states to move into this area. And so we think that 2016, for all the success that we've enjoyed since 2011 when we released our Secure Choice Pension proposal, is going to be even a bigger year because of some of the certainty that's going to be coming down from the federal government. So stay tuned on that front as well. So Leigh, going back to SAFE, our two organizations sent a letter to the senator. We shared it with him. Do you want to talk a little bit about what the letter said and what our concerns were?
Sure. Bottom line, even though this stacked annuity approach might sound like it's a reasonable way in which to get to the same place, I think there are numerous reasons why I don't think that'll happen, Hank. And we could spend a lot of time just talking about that. It doesn't provide for disability and survivor benefits. That's not part of the annuity package. That would be an added cost. We've talked about the uncertainty with regard to what kind of a benefit there would be there. One of the things is who stands behind that guarantee. It's not the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation. It would be state guarantee associations for the insurance industry. And that's not pre-funded. So there are a lot of problems with it. But I think going to our letter to Senator Hatch, what we focused on was if there were provisions in federal law right now that were prohibiting a state, if it so chose to do so, to try this approach, then what are they? And let's take care of them. If it's something to do with limits on contributions, if there are uncertainties, let's provide some clarity there. But beyond that, if a state chooses to follow this approach, let the state choose the manner in which it goes about doing that. Provide needed flexibility for states. Let them be that laboratory, that great laboratory of experimentation out there. And if there's a role to be played by annuities in this process, and the insurance industry feels that they can do so effectively in helping to offset any risks, then I think that will happen. And so what our letter basically says is, to the extent that that's not what the Hatch bill does, again, it precludes a plan from continuing its defined benefit program in tandem with an annuity product. It says if you go down this path, you have to do it this way. The RFPs have to be this way, limitations on how much you can contribute. So I think our point has been that given the prescriptive impact that the Hatch bill would have on this kind of approach, NCTR and NCPERS oppose it. And that's what we, bottom line, said to Senator Hatch. If he decides that, again, maybe some technical tweaks here and there to the code could take care of a perceived impediment, that's a different story. And I think NCTR would be willing to go back and take a look at what that proposal looks like and perhaps, approach it a little bit differently. But right now, again, even though we're hearing from Senator Hatch's staff that they intend to make modifications to the bill, we've not seen them yet. Yeah. And so it's awfully difficult to be able to say, well, yes, this added flexibility in concept's a great idea, but let's see it in paper. Mm-hmm. And that's what I think we're concerned about. I am encouraged, Hank, that Senator Hatch's staff indicated that we would see the legislation before he attempted to attach it to something else, because as Tony was discussing, I think one of our concerns is that a tax bill that's moving, Senator Hatch has certainly indicated in the past that this would be a candidate for attaching to that bill. And so, in fairness, I hope Senator Hatch's staff lives up to that promise and lets us take a look at the legislation. But again, I've not heard anything that suggests that the concerns that we've raised with the legislation are going to be among those kinds of tweaks that he's considering. I would hope so, but I'm not very confident.
So Tony, you and your firm, you specialize in tax legislation and tax law and lobbying. You mentioned that you didn't anticipate a big, large tax bill going this year. But interestingly enough, those two provisions that were passed were standalone. Not generally the case, right?
No.
Is this a new model, or what's the explanation, or is there an explanation?
I don't know. I think there are several, probably, explanations. One of which is the members of the Senate Finance and Ways and Means Committees are in a position to do, exercise great power over the tax code. And for several Congresses prior to this one, they've kind of been bottled up waiting for the big reform bill. So I think, Chairman Ryan, Chairman Hatch both saw that kind of pent-up demand and decided, clearly, because they have the power to do so, they and the leadership, that they would let individual bills go, that the policy was agreeable, bipartisan, and so it's maybe not a new model. It's certainly refreshing, because where you do have these individual narrow issues, to not have to wait for the big bill that comes maybe once every 5 years, 8 years, you can't tell. So, that's why I mentioned the other two issues as to, possibilities for this kind of narrow individual treatment.
Okay. Along those lines, I think an issue that's been percolating in Washington, D.C., if not through the rest of the country, is the excise tax on high premium health insurance. Right. What's the latest you're hearing on that? And what do you think the ultimate legislative strategy for any sort of reform or repeal of that, how would that take shape?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And very timely, because I think there's a lot more energy behind that issue than there was even a couple months ago. The excise tax, of course, doesn't take effect for several years, but when you negotiate your contracts with your employees through collective bargaining, you're kind of having to deal with it now. In fact, some said they were dealing with it last year already. So there is a bipartisan concern about this, and it's a 40% excise tax on the premiums that are over the certain threshold. Congressman Joe Courtney of Connecticut has introduced a bill, H.R. 2050, which has 110 Democratic sponsors, co-sponsors. That's very telling of a provision that was in the Affordable Care Act. That was, of course, a very Democratic initiative. I think we can say that clearly. That bill also has 8 Republicans on it. Similarly, there's a Republican bill, H.R. 879, that has 64 Republican co-sponsors on it, 4 Ways and Means Republicans. So you can kind of get a sense here that there are a lot of members concerned about it. You're not quite at 218, which is more than half of the House of Representatives, but you're starting to build up some pretty big numbers, and these are repeal bills. The big obstacle with it, with the repeal, is that the excise tax is projected to bring in $80 billion over the next 10 years. So you have to find a way to pay for that revenue loss, or you have to ignore it, which is somewhat hard to do. So it's a very topical and timely issue right now.
Okay, thank you. So we will open up the lines for questions. So Bailey, one of the first questions we have is in regard to Illinois. Given sort of the budget issue that's going on in the state, to what degree is that playing into the overall conversation about pensions?
That's a great question. I think with Illinois and New Jersey, I see them as a little bit separate from what we deal with in most other states. And the reason I say that, as I was mentioning, the Boston College research, Wisconsin system, Indiana system, most pension systems are recovering from the recession. Illinois and New Jersey have had so many years of lack of payments that they're in a little bit different shape. And so I think, what I try to emphasize for folks is that those two states are in a very different position than most states that we're talking about. So I think for the most part, you don't see Illinois and New Jersey being used as examples in other states of why to do that, because you can really, especially in Illinois, I mean, it is decades of underfunding the pension system, unfortunately. So I think that I don't want to say that's a bright spot, because it's not exactly, especially for those two states, but I think because they're so unique in the kinds of problems that they have, it's not something that has moved to other states too much as an example of why we need to make changes to pension systems. Now, that said, in Illinois, they have very real budget problems, as probably everyone knows. I don't think that's news to anyone. And the Supreme Court there ruled in our favor, challenging the changes that they made to the system in Illinois. It's a great ruling, by the way, if you just want some entertaining court rulings to read in your free time this summer. But they basically said, the state can't cut benefits to workers because it's been fiscally irresponsible. And so it was very favorable and kind of, shamed the government quite a bit, and it was a unanimous ruling. So that said, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a solution there, and it's something that the state's going to have to continue working on. And unfortunately, Governor Rauner is just not a very friendly person when it comes to trying to find something reasonable to protect workers' benefits. I mean, I believe he's introduced more legislation to cut benefits that most people think is not going to be constitutional already, based on the previous court case that was just ruled a couple weeks ago. But it's going to be tough. We got a long road ahead in Illinois.
Okay. Next question is also to you, which is, can you clarify the grant making process that you mentioned earlier?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, just describe it a little bit, and what it's for, and how one would go about applying for it.
Oh, absolutely. So what we do, again, we'll take a look at states across the country, look for, as I talked about in January, mostly defensive opportunities, but maybe next year we'll have some opportunities to do some proactive work to strengthen stability of systems, like we did in Indiana or Texas, for example, where we're getting guarantees of funding, some different things like that. But primarily, if a state thinks that there's going to be a bill to convert to a 401k style system for public employees, or there's going to be a bill to allow employees or entities and employers to opt out of the pension system, anything that's going to be a threat to the stability of the pension system, we're interested in helping provide support for that if there's a coalition in the state that's willing to work together. So we have a couple of requirements. One, folks in state have to be willing to sit down at the table and work together on doing fighting back that kind of legislation. So we ask that there be a coalition in the state. If there's not one that exists already, we're happy to help be a part of pulling that together with all the interested parties that should be a part of it. Second, we ask for there to be some buy-in at the local level, so some monetary contribution from the parties at that coalition. It does not have to be a one-to-one match for what NPPC might provide to the state, but we do want to see that people in state are really committed to that effort, knowing that it might require some resources if we're doing patch-through calls, or trying to put out new research, some things like that. So we ask for there to be a local commitment that folks are bringing to the table. And then we're going to ask for a plan for, what are you expecting? How are we going to beat or pass legislation? What are the tactics we're going to use? How are we going to do our earned media efforts? All of those kind of things. And again, that's something that NPPC can work with the state on, is really putting together a good targeted plan to be successful in the state. And so once you have all those pieces together, that's something that I'll take to my board for approval. And then, if the board here approves of the plan, and generally, you can talk to this, Hank, but, looking for those components I just mentioned, a plan that we think can be successful and has the local buy-in, then we're happy to work with you and provide, continued campaign support with earned media and talking points and things like that. So that process, the way that it works, if you're interested and have not worked with us before, just feel free to get in touch, and we can forward the grant application process that we just sent out to states. Again, that was this Monday of this week. And then folks can get partners together in state, and we're happy to help them put that together.
Great, yeah. Thank you. Leigh, next question is to you, which is, if assuming that the Hatch bill gets reintroduced largely in the same way as it was a couple years ago, because it's optional, why is it a concern if it is not mandatory? It's not a mandate from the federal government.
Sure, and I think that's an interesting aspect to the bill. I think the concern, Hank, is that if you have this new piece of legislation adopted, even though it's not mandatory, it will sort of have that federal seal of approval. This is a replacement for a defined benefit plan. And I think what concerns me is that someone out there will decide, well, let's try it. And it may look appealing. It may look like it would effectively cap a state's expenditures. And that would be all that, quite frankly, they may be looking at, is that aspect of it. Again, it wouldn't do anything about the unfunded liability in terms of reducing that. It would actually exacerbate that problem. But nonetheless, if somebody decided to try and do it, the consequences of that move wouldn't really be seen for 20 or 30 years until all of the annuities would be paid out, assuming that same insurance company would be there, and we wouldn't have some of the other problems we might have as far as insurance company challenges. And then I think once one state tries it, then I think the concern is that other states would think, well, let's try it as well. And so I think, again, it would be a dangerous, slippery slope, if you will, toward the abandonment of the defined benefit structure, and I think that would be a real mistake. So that's I think, bottom line, why I think even though it's not mandatory, if it's a good idea and plans would want to do this and states would want to do this, employers would want to do this, and the insurance industry would be willing to support it, then let's just clear away whatever deadwood there is that prohibits that from happening right now, rather than coming up with this new replacement plan that the federal government says is something you should consider. The President calls it a tool in the toolkit, but he's taking other tools out of that toolkit, and I think that's really unfortunate. So I think it has some veneer of, hey, this is not a problem, it's just an option out there, an additional tool, but I think it's a real danger.
And as you and I both know, public plans have been addressing risk in all its various forms. And I think ostensibly one of the arguments for the SAFE bill is about risk. And you want to talk a little bit about what risks Chairman Hatch is trying to address, and is it really plausible under this format?
Sure. Well, yeah, I think Preston will tell you it's longevity risk. That's the big bugaboo that he's worried about, and that is that people are living so much longer than plans had anticipated and had funded for, that this is where plans are really going to get into trouble, and that it's better to offset that, to lay that off onto the private sector with the argument that they can better handle that risk. But I think bottom line is a state, a government is always going to be at risk for that benefit. It really is. It's either because it's a guaranteed benefit, in which case if the insurance company goes away or something happens, the state's still going to have to pay that benefit. So I think that's a challenge. And a state's at risk even if it's now done away with its defined benefit plan. So we're not talking about a guaranteed benefit, but we are talking about giving people enough to live on in retirement security. And if there's not retirement security, even Senator Hatch has acknowledged in other writings that there's a consequence to that for government at state, local, and federal level in terms of increased social services requirements. So I think I would suggest that Senator Hatch needs to look at that risk in a much more holistic manner. Longevity risk is something that plans already address. I think, and we do a very effective job of that, and we're constantly fine-tuning as those mortality tables change. I think it's something that can be dealt with within the defined benefit structure very effectively, very cost-effectively. So that's the argument that Senator Hatch would make, but I really think when you examine it more closely, I don't think it holds up.
Okay. And lastly, Tony, to you, in terms of the web modification bill, is there any details on the numbers and how it would modify the reduction?
Well, there are two groups of beneficiaries who are kind of set up under the bill. As I mentioned, the first group are those who are already in the WEP formula. They're retired. They're seeing their benefit be reduced under the WEP formula, or have not reached age 62 or will not reach age 62 by January 1 of 2017. For those folks, it's going to be a reduction of what is taken out. So if you look at WEP, and what WEP does is it takes your first tranche of income from what would be a 90% return. It's a small amount of income. Yep. It's $825 a month, down to 40%. It's very arbitrary, and it's across the board. This provides a buffer to that, and I think it's about 32% that the Social Security actuary has estimated of an increased benefit for those folks in that first set. For the folks in the second set, which are going to be reaching age 62 later, they're going to have their work history analyzed first as if they were completely under the WEP program, and then secondly as if it reflects reality, which is you work this many years in a covered employment and an additional number of years in non-covered. So you're going to see folks getting the actual work history. As for making the bill revenue neutral, which is an important selling point that Congressman Brady has been touting, and the Social Security actuary, at least in a draft report, said that this in fact would be, is that they're going to have a great deal more data entering the Social Security Administration as to those folks who should have been under the WEP program and were not. So there are going to be some howls, I'm sure, of
some losers,
of despair that in fact now they are being wept, but they really should have been the whole time. So as it looks right now, the bill could be and is forecast to be revenue neutral, which is very important. The previous repeal bills were $30 billion over 10-year losers, which were non-starters.
And somewhat related to our prior conversation about a bigger bill or a standalone bill, there really isn't any conversation about Social Security reform, is there? And so, again, you think this has the potential of going on as a standalone?
The only conversation about legislation, other than the WEP, which is very preliminary, is around disability on Social Security, because there has been cases of fraud in New York City. I think that was the most widely circulated in the media situation of a couple of years ago. And Congress has looked and is looking at the disability section of Social Security. So that would be the only vehicle on Social Security. There's no legislation pending on mandatory Social Security, for those who are not covered today, which is a concern of ours, certainly, going forward. So that would really be it. I think this focus on disability.
Okay. So I've been told that we've exhausted all of our questions. So I do want to thank our panelists, Leigh Snell, Tony Roda, and Bailey Childers for joining us today. And I want to thank all of you for dialing in. Thank you very much for participating, and we look forward to talking with you in the very near future. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.